So now that we got a handle on adding a script to a game object to create some kind of game engine input on that object, let's try to do the same thing using Playmaker. In the previous presentation, we went through the process of setting up Playmaker, so your interface should look very similar to mine, which is I have my project assets down on the bottom left side. I have my Playmaker editor window, and again, that's the Playmaker drop-down menu, Playmaker editor, and I've nested that to the right of my project folder. In addition to that, I went to Playmaker editor windows, and I chose to open up the action browser, which I then nested to the right of my inspector. Now, as I mentioned in the previous presentation, if you're tight on screen real estate, you can nest your actions behind your inspector, but there will come a time when we want to see both the inspector and the actions panel. So I'm just going to separate those two. I often like to keep the right side of my desktop, at least if you're on a Mac, available so that if I put any assets on my desktop, I can easily drag them into my project folder. So now I'm going to select my cube and I'm just going to go to the rotate script component, and I'm going to remove that component using that method that I demonstrated earlier, which is just click on this little cog and remove component, and just confirm that there's no animation on this object. I'll also turn my statistics off. I won't need those for this presentation. So I have this cube, and this is going to be kind of my guinea pig, the thing that I play around with and test different functionality. Now, when we create interactivity on game objects using scripts or using Playmaker, we're setting up input opportunity for either the game engine or user input to interact with game objects inside our scene. So I want to create something very similar to the rotate script using Playmaker. And Playmaker is a state machine. It's going to be very intuitive, the way that we get this set up, but there's a few conventions that we need to get used to. The first thing is that unless you have a compelling reason to do otherwise, the target object that you want to add the animation or interactivity to should be selected. So I'm just selecting this cube. And I want to create a Playmaker state machine on this cube. And the way that I'll do that is I'll go to the Playmaker editor, and in this big gray window here where it says right click to add FSM, I'll do just that. I'm going to right click or control click and choose to add FSM. Now FSM stands for a finite state machine. And once we do that, you can see that we have a start state and we have a state 1. Now state machines are just different states of programming logic. And you'll see here in a short bit that we can flow from one state, we can add multiple states, and we'll flow to others. A state machine in its simplest form you can think of as kind of like a light switch. It's either on or it's off. In the case of this state machine, we're actually going to only have one state, and the state is going to be, it's always going to be on. Now let me give you a quick tour of the state machine, the Playmaker interface. So I'm looking at the Playmaker editor window, and this is where most of the magic is going to happen, between this side of the panel, the outline view, and on the right side we have our different panels inside our Playmaker editor. We have an FSM tab, and this is just the place where we can go to name the FSM. We're not going to get to that for a while. We're going to spend most of our time between state, event, and variable. Now the state is just showing us the content of, in this case, state 1, and currently there are no actions on state 1. We'll talk about events and variables a little bit later in this presentation, but for now, you can tell I have state 1 selected. If I deselect state 1, you can see that it's no longer highlighted, and if I click on it again, it'll highlight. As I select and deselect, you can see that the state window populates with state information. If I click on state 1, I can see here that I'm looking at state 1. This is the title of the state here. So if I want to rename state 1 to something more appropriate, maybe I'll call this rotate, because that's the only job this state is going to do. It's going to cause this cube to rotate. With that state selected, I could go down here in the bottom right hand corner and click the action browser, but I already have the action browser available. So with this rotate state selected, I'm going to go to my actions browser, and I just want to kind of browse through this panel and see what it's made of. The action browser has all of these different categories, and this is all the different kinds of input and information that we can get from the game engine based on game objects. Okay, so If I want to modify, let's say, the color of an object, I have the ability to do that under the Color tab. But what I'm most interested in is affecting the transform component, just like we did with the rotate script. I want to influence the transform rotation. Okay, so if I look through this catalog of this library of actions, if I go down, I'll notice that there's a transform section. And if I click on the transform button, you can see that it gives me all of these options to manipulate the transform component of an object. And what I'm most interested in is the ability to rotate this object. Okay, so I have my rotate state selected, and I'm just going to find the action that I want to add, and I'll just double click. Now I could also click and drag, and you'll notice that now I have two instances of the rotate state. So just like removing a component from a script, there's a little settings cog over here, and if I grab that, at the bottom of the list, I can choose to remove that action. So this rotate state currently has a rotate action. And I have all these different parameters that I can choose to manipulate and modify the game object this is attached to. I'm going to run through this process really quickly, and then I'll review the process. So I have a state machine attached, and inside the rotate state, I've added this rotate action. I have the ability now to manipulate these different parameters. There's a lot of different stuff in here, but we want to really only focus on either the X, Y, or Z angle. We'll take a closer look at some of these other components later. If I want to influence the Y angle, rotate along the Y, that will cause it to rotate around its vertical or its green or yellow axis in this case, because I have it selected. So you'll notice that in the Y angle, there's a little drop-down menu here, and it won't let me really do anything. And the reason for that is it's looking for a variable. And we have this little toggle button over here on the right side. Whenever there's a drop-down menu, if this little button to the right of it is available, if you click on that, that will toggle between the ability to enter in a hard value and toggle that button back on versus looking for a variable. We'll talk about variables in a future presentation, but I want the ability to hard code a value into the Y angle, causing it to rotate at that rate. So what I'll do is I'll toggle this button. You can see that that drop down menu turns into a 0, and now I'll just type in a value. I'm going to type in 45. Now when I hit the play button, you'll notice that my cube is rotating so fast it just kind of looks like a blur. It looks like it's shaking back and forth. So I'll toggle the play button. I'll go back into my rotate state, and you can see that I'm rotating really fast, but I'm actually, it's not rotating so fast. It's rotating per frame update, 45 degrees per frame update. And you'll notice that there's some other little checkboxes down here. One of the options are per second. There's also an every frame, which is by default in this action is checked. So I'm going to leave that checked, and I'm going to say I want to rotate this along the Y angle 45 degrees per second every frame. I'll hit the play button, and that should slow things down. So a couple things are happening here. When I hit the play button, I'm getting a preview inside the Playmaker editor of what states are playing, and currently you can see that the rotate state is highlighted in green, which means that I'm currently in that state. I have an action that's highlighted green here, and that's showing me that I'm actually in the process of rotating. And in addition to that, there's actually a little state label that's showing up over this object. That's letting me know what state of the state machine that I'm in. And this can be useful information, but because our state machine only has one state, it's only doing one thing, and that is whatever actions are attached to this state, it's executing that action in the state. So let's take a few minutes and set up a similar scenario. Now I'm going to review this process really quickly from the ground up and put a finer point on a couple of things. I do want to point out before I delete this object, there's a little icon that popped up. This is the developer icon, the Hatung Games, the developer of Playmaker. You'll notice this little icon pops up on any object that we attach a state machine to. Now I'm going to select the cube, and I'm going to either right click or choose to command delete to completely get rid of that game object. And I'll do this from the ground up again. I'm going to go to game objects, and I'm going to create a cube. And the cube, this is just a little test object to play around with state machines. You'll notice that the cube in the hierarchy does not have that icon on it until I go to Playmaker and right click and choose to add a state machine. Now, Playmaker refers to adding an FSM. I'm going to just refer to these as state machines. I'm not going to include the F. And we'll talk about what the implications of a state machine are in further detail in the next presentation. But for now, I have a one-state machine. It is indicating what the start state is. It starts and runs into state 1. I'm going to go from the State tab with my State tab selected. I'm going to go to the Actions menu. The Action Browser I can find by clicking on this button. I can also go to Playmaker Editor window, Action Browser, but you should have already nested your Action Browser in the top right-hand side. I'm going to look for the Transform category, and inside Transform, I'm looking to Rotate, so I'll just select Rotate. And I have two options once I select the Rotate. I can double-click on it to add it here, or I can click and drag it into the state. Now remember, I can rename my state if I want to, but for the sake of this demo, I'm just going to let it default and say state 1. When I want to modify one of these values, if I can't key in a value here, that means I need to toggle that button to a different mode. This allows me to directly input data. I'll just type in 20, and I'll make sure I check the per frame. Otherwise, it's rotating at this rate per frame update. In the previous presentation, we discovered that in my case, my monitor is updating 120 times per second. So that's going to be a pretty fast rate. So I want to unify this so that it's per second. It's using kind of a universal time system. And I'll hit the play button, and now I start to see my cube rotate. Okay, so let's go through that process, get our cube to rotate. In the next presentation, we'll take a deeper look at state machines and opportunities to provide input. We'll do that in the next presentation.